The morning mist clung to the ancient stones of Windsor Castle like a shroud, carrying with it the weight of secrets that had festered within the royal walls for decades. Queen Camilla stood at the tall windows of her private chambers, her fingers trembling against the cold glass as she watched the gardeners tend to the rose gardens below. These same gardens where she had once walked hand in hand with Charles during their courtship, where promises had been whispered and dreams had been shared. Now, those memories felt like fragments of someone else's life. The golden light of dawn filtered through the heavy curtains, casting long shadows across the ornate furniture that had witnessed countless royal dramas throughout the centuries. Camilla's reflection stared back at her from the window, and she barely recognized the woman she had become. The confident mistress who had once commanded Charles's complete attention, the woman who had weathered decades of public scrutiny and emerged victorious as his queen, now appeared fragile and uncertain. Her lady-in-waiting, Margaret, entered quietly with the morning tea service, her footsteps muffled by the thick Persian carpet. The elderly woman had served the royal household for over 30 years and had developed an almost supernatural ability to read the moods and tensions that ebbed and flowed through the palace corridors. She noticed immediately the tension in Camilla's shoulders, the way her usually impeccable posture seemed to have crumbled overnight. "Your Majesty," Margaret said softly, setting the silver tray on the mahogany side table with practiced precision. "His Majesty has requested your presence in the blue drawing room at 10 o'clock this morning. He mentioned it was a matter of some urgency." Camilla's heart lurched in her chest, though she maintained her composure with the skill of someone who had spent years perfecting the art of royal deportment. The blue drawing room was where Charles conducted his most serious business, where difficult conversations took place away from the prying eyes and ears of the palace staff. It was not a place for casual morning discussions or affectionate exchanges between husband and wife. "Did he mention the nature of this urgent matter?" Camilla asked, her voice steady despite the storm of anxiety building within her chest. She turned from the window, accepting the delicate china teacup that Margaret offered, though her appetite had completely vanished. Margaret hesitated for a moment, her weathered hands fidgeting with her pristine white apron. In all her years of service, she had learned when to speak and when to remain silent, when information was meant to be shared and when it was better left unspoken. But the genuine concern in the Queen's eyes compelled her to reveal what she knew. "His Majesty received several visitors yesterday evening, ma'am. Lord Pemberton arrived after dinner, followed by the Archbishop of Canterbury and Sir James Morrison from the Cabinet Office. They remained in conference until well past midnight." Margaret's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. The household staff were dismissed early, and even Mr. Henderson was asked to leave the premises. The significance of this information was not lost on Camilla. Mr. Henderson had been Charles's most trusted valet and confidant for over 20 years. If even he had been asked to leave during these mysterious meetings, it meant that whatever was being discussed was of the utmost sensitivity and importance. The kind of conversations that could reshape the monarchy, alter the course of history, or destroy lives with a few carefully chosen words. Camilla set down her teacup with trembling hands, the fine china rattling softly against the saucer. She had spent sleepless nights recently, plagued by a growing sense of unease that she couldn't quite articulate. Charles had been distant, distracted, spending long hours in private meetings and hushed telephone conversations. Their once intimate dinners had become formal affairs, conducted with polite conversation about safe topics while carefully avoiding anything of real substance. The weight of the crown, which had once felt like the culmination of her life's ambitions, now seemed to press down upon her shoulders like a burden she could no longer bear. She had fought for decades to claim her place beside Charles, enduring public humiliation, media scrutiny, and the bitter resentment of those who believed she could never replace Diana's memory in the hearts of the British people. She walked to her dressing table, where photographs of happier times were displayed in silver frames. There was the picture from their wedding day, both of them radiant with joy and relief that they could finally be together openly. Another showed them at various state functions, standing side by side as partners in the great work of the monarchy. But now, looking at these images, Camilla could see what she had missed at the time. The subtle signs of Charles's restlessness, the way his eyes sometimes seemed to be looking beyond her towards something she couldn't see. The palace corridors stretched endlessly before her as she made her way toward the blue drawing room, her heels clicking against the marble floors with a rhythm that seemed to echo her increasingly rapid heartbeat. Portraits of long-dead monarchs gazed down at her from their gilded frames, their painted eyes seeming to judge her worthiness to walk among them. She had always felt like an intruder in these hallowed halls, despite her official title and the reverence with which the staff treated her. As she approached the ornate double doors that led to the blue drawing room, she could hear the murmur of voices from within. Charles's distinctive baritone was joined by at least two other men, their tones serious and urgent. Camilla paused for a moment, gathering her courage and trying to prepare herself for whatever revelation awaited her behind those doors. The footman stationed outside the room bowed respectfully as she approached, then knocked softly to announce her arrival. The conversation within ceased immediately, replaced by an ominous silence that seemed to stretch for an eternity. When the doors finally opened, Camilla was greeted by the sight of Charles standing behind his desk, his face grave and unreadable. Lord Pemberton and Sir James Morrison were seated in the leather chairs facing the desk, their expressions equally somber. "Camilla," Charles said, his voice formal and distant in a way that immediately set her on edge. "Please, take a seat. We have much to discuss." She moved gracefully across the room, her years of training allowing her to maintain perfect composure even as her mind raced with possibilities. The men rose politely as she entered, but there was none of the warmth or deference she had grown accustomed to. Instead, there was an air of barely concealed tension, as if they were all participants in some elaborate theater production where everyone knew their roles except her. The blue drawing room had always been one of her favorite spaces in the palace, with its elegant furnishings and priceless artwork creating an atmosphere of refined sophistication. But today, it felt more like a courtroom, with Charles positioned behind his desk like a judge preparing to deliver a verdict that would change everything. "I've asked Lord Pemberton and Sir James to join us this morning because the matters we need to discuss have implications that extend far beyond our personal relationship," Charles began, his words carefully measured and devoid of emotion. "The monarchy faces challenges today that require difficult decisions, decisions that may not be popular but are necessary for the institution's survival." Camilla felt a chill run through her body, though the room was perfectly warm. She had heard Charles speak in this tone before, usually when he was addressing matters of state or delivering difficult news to government officials. But never had he used this cold, official voice when speaking to her. It was as if he had already distanced himself from her emotionally, creating a barrier that she couldn't cross. "The public's perception of our marriage has become a liability," he continued, his eyes fixed on a point somewhere beyond her shoulder. "Recent polling data shows a significant decline in support for the monarchy, with much of the criticism centered on questions about legitimacy and moral authority. The people remember Diana, Camilla. They remember the circumstances that brought us together, and they have not forgiven." The words hit her like physical blows, each one carefully chosen to inflict maximum damage. She had known that their relationship would always be controversial, that there would always be those who viewed her as the other woman who had broken up Charles's marriage to the beloved Princess of Wales. But she had believed that time would heal those wounds, that her dedication to royal duties and charitable work would eventually win over the hearts of the British people. Lord Pemberton cleared his throat diplomatically before speaking. "Your Majesty, the recent events in Parliament and the discussions about the future of the monarchy have created a situation where difficult choices must be made. The government has expressed serious concerns about public support for the crown, and there are voices calling for significant reforms." Sir James Morrison nodded gravely. "The Prime Minister has been quite clear in his communications with His Majesty. The monarchy must demonstrate its commitment to the values that the British people hold dear. There are questions being raised about whether the current arrangement serves the best interests of the institution." Camilla's mind struggled to process what she was hearing. Were they suggesting that her marriage to Charles was somehow threatening the very foundations of the monarchy? That her presence as queen was undermining everything they had worked to build together? The implications were staggering, and she felt as if the ground was shifting beneath her feet. "What exactly are you proposing?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. She looked directly at Charles, searching his face for some sign of the man she had loved for so many years, some indication that he would fight for their relationship as she had fought for it throughout their long and tumultuous history together. But the man who looked back at her was not her husband, not her partner in love and life. He was the king, cold and calculating, weighing the costs and benefits of their union with the same dispassionate analysis he might apply to any other matter of state. The transformation was complete and terrifying, and Camilla realized with growing horror that she had lost him long before this moment. Charles leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled before him in a gesture she had seen him make countless times during difficult negotiations. "The Archbishop and I have been discussing the possibility of an annulment," he said quietly. "Canon law provides certain provisions for marriages that may not have been valid from the beginning, given the circumstances of our relationship and the prior obligations that existed." The room seemed to spin around Camilla as the full meaning of his words sank in. An annulment would not simply end their marriage. It would erase it entirely, as if it had never existed. All the years they had spent together, all the battles they had fought to be united, all the sacrifices she had made to become his queen, it would all be swept away with a few legal documents and ecclesiastical pronouncements. "You're asking me to agree to the destruction of everything we've built together," she said, her voice growing stronger as anger began to replace shock. "You want me to pretend that our love, our marriage, our life together meant nothing, that it was all some elaborate mistake that can be corrected with the stroke of a pen." Charles's expression remained unchanged, though she thought she detected a flicker of something, regret, perhaps, or pain, in his eyes. "I'm asking you to consider what's best for the monarchy, for Britain, and ultimately for both of us. This situation has become untenable, Camilla. Every day we remain married, the institution loses more credibility, more support from the people we are meant to serve." The cruelty of his words was breathtaking in its calculated precision. He was using her love for the monarchy, her genuine commitment to royal duty, as a weapon against her. He knew that she had dedicated herself completely to the role of queen, that she had worked tirelessly to prove herself worthy of the position. Now he was suggesting that her very presence in that role was destroying everything she had worked to protect. "And what becomes of me after this annulment?" she asked, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. "Do I simply disappear, retreat to some quiet corner where I can't embarrass the crown any further? Do I become a non-person, someone whose existence is inconvenient to the official narrative?" Lord Pemberton shifted uncomfortably in his chair, clearly aware that they were venturing into dangerous territory. "Your Majesty, there would naturally be provisions made for your comfort and security. The royal household would ensure that you are well cared for, with appropriate accommodations and financial support." "A pension," Camilla said bitterly. "You're offering me a pension in exchange for my crown, my title, my identity. How generous of you all." She stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the polished floor with a sound that seemed unnaturally loud in the tense atmosphere of the room. The three men rose with her, but she held up a hand to stop them from any formal courtesies. The time for such pretense had passed. "I need time to consider this proposal," she said, her voice carefully controlled despite the emotional storm raging within her. "I assume you're not expecting an immediate answer to such a momentous request." Charles nodded slowly. "Of course. But, Camilla, time is a luxury we don't have much of. The situation is deteriorating rapidly, and decisions will need to be made soon, with or without your cooperation." The threat was implicit but unmistakable. They would proceed with their plans whether she agreed or not, whether she cooperated in her own destruction or forced them to find other means of achieving their goals. She was being given the illusion of choice, but, in reality, the decision had already been made without her input or consent. As she walked toward the door, Camilla felt the weight of centuries of royal history pressing down upon her. How many other women had walked these same corridors, believing themselves secure in their positions only to discover that their value was determined entirely by political necessity and public opinion. The monarchy had survived for 1,000 years by adapting to changing circumstances, often at the expense of individuals who had outlived their usefulness. The door closed behind her with a soft click that sounded like the end of everything she had ever dreamed of becoming. In the corridor beyond, life in the palace continued as if nothing had changed. Servants went about their duties with quiet efficiency, courtiers hurried to their appointments, and the great machine of the monarchy ground on relentlessly. But, for Camilla, the world had fundamentally shifted, and she knew that nothing would ever be the same again. The afternoon sun cast long shadows through the mullioned windows of Camilla's private study, creating patterns of light and darkness that seemed to mirror the chaos in her mind. She had fled to this sanctuary after the devastating meeting in the blue drawing room, seeking solace among the books and personal treasures that had always brought her comfort. But, today, even her most cherished possessions felt like accusations, reminders of a life that was apparently built on unstable foundations. Her hands shook as she poured herself a generous glass of brandy from the crystal decanter on her desk, though it was barely past noon. The amber liquid burned as it slid down her throat, but it did nothing to numb the pain that seemed to emanate from the very core of her being. She had endured public humiliation before, weathered storms of criticism and scandal that would have destroyed lesser women. But this betrayal cut deeper than anything she had experienced, because it came from the one person she had trusted completely. The telephone on her desk rang with its distinctive Westminster chime, causing her to jump despite herself. She stared at the device for several rings before finally lifting the receiver, her voice carefully modulated despite her inner turmoil. "Yes, Your Majesty," came the crisp voice of her private secretary, Mrs. Hartwell. "Lady Spencer is here to see you. She says it's a matter of some urgency, and that she believes you'll want to speak with her immediately." Camilla's blood ran cold. Lady Spencer, Diana's sister, Sarah, had maintained a careful distance from the royal family since Diana's death, appearing only at the most formal state occasions and speaking to the press only when absolutely necessary. Her sudden appearance at the palace could only mean that news of the morning's meeting had somehow leaked, or worse, that she was somehow involved in the conspiracy against Camilla's position. "Send her up," Camilla said quietly, setting down her brandy glass and smoothing her hair with trembling fingers. Whatever Lady Spencer had come to say, Camilla would face it with what dignity she could muster. The wait seemed interminable, though it was probably only a few minutes before Mrs. Hartwell ushered the visitor into the study. Lady Spencer entered with the same fluid grace that had made her younger sister so captivating, but her face was etched with lines of concern and what appeared to be genuine sympathy. She was dressed in an elegant navy suit that spoke of understated wealth and good breeding, her silver hair perfectly styled despite the obvious haste of her visit. "Sarah," Camilla said, rising from her chair with practiced courtesy despite the circumstances. "This is an unexpected pleasure. Please, won't you sit down?" Lady Spencer remained standing for a moment, studying Camilla's face with an intensity that was both uncomfortable and oddly reassuring. When she finally spoke, her voice carried a warmth that Camilla hadn't expected. "Camilla, I came as soon as I heard. My contacts in Westminster have been buzzing all morning with rumors about emergency meetings and constitutional crises. I thought you should know what's being said." The kindness in her voice was almost more devastating than Charles's cold formality had been. Camilla had prepared herself for condemnation, for the righteous anger of Diana's sister finally, given an opportunity to exact revenge for years of perceived wrongs. Instead, she was being offered something that felt uncomfortably like compassion. "Please, do sit down," Camilla said again, gesturing to one of the comfortable chairs near the fireplace. "I assume you've heard something specific, or you wouldn't have made this journey." Lady Spencer settled herself in the chair with elegant precision, then fixed Camilla with a direct gaze that reminded her powerfully of Diana's own penetrating stare. "There are whispers that Charles is seeking an annulment, that he's been meeting with senior church officials and constitutional lawyers about the process of dissolving your marriage." The confirmation of what Camilla already knew still hit her like a physical blow. Hearing it from an outside source made it real in a way that the morning's confrontation hadn't quite achieved. This wasn't just Charles's private struggle with their relationship. It had already become a matter of public speculation and political calculation. "May I ask where you heard this?" Camilla asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted to know the answer. "My late husband served in the cabinet for many years," Lady Spencer replied carefully. "I maintain friendships with several people who are still in positions of influence. They're concerned about what this might mean for the stability of the monarchy, and, frankly, they're appalled by the way it's being handled." There was something in Lady Spencer's tone that suggested she knew more than she was revealing, and Camilla found herself leaning forward despite her emotional exhaustion. Any information that might help her understand the forces arrayed against her was precious now. "What exactly are they saying about the way it's being handled?" Lady Spencer hesitated for a moment, then seemed to reach a decision. "There's a faction within the government and the church that has been working toward this outcome for months, possibly longer. They believe that your marriage to Charles has become a liability that threatens the long-term survival of the monarchy. But, Camilla, you should know that not everyone agrees with this assessment." The revelation that this had been planned for months hit Camilla like a thunderbolt. All those evenings when Charles had been distant and preoccupied, all those mysterious meetings and hushed telephone calls, he had been plotting her downfall while sharing her bed and accepting her support. The betrayal was so complete, so calculated, that she felt physically ill. How long have you known? Camilla asked, her voice barely audible. I first heard rumors 3 weeks ago, Lady Spencer admitted. I debated whether to warn you, but I hoped that the rumors were false, or that Charles would come to his senses before things went too far. I'm afraid I may have waited too long. 3 weeks. For 3 weeks, while Camilla had continued to perform her royal duties, attend state functions, and present herself to the world as the devoted queen consort, her husband had been actively working to erase her from his life and from history. The scope of the deception was breathtaking. Why are you telling me this? Camilla asked, genuinely puzzled. Diana was your sister. I would think you'd be pleased to see me brought low. Lady Spencer was quiet for a long moment, her gaze fixed on the crackling fire. When she finally spoke, her voice was thoughtful and sad. Diana is gone, Camilla. She's been gone for many years now, and all the anger and resentment in the world won't bring her back. What's happening to you now isn't justice for her. It's just cruelty disguised as political necessity. The unexpected compassion was almost too much to bear. Camilla had prepared herself for a lifetime of being viewed as the villain in Diana's story, the other woman who had stolen the fairy tale prince and corrupted the monarchy. To hear Diana's own sister speak of her with something approaching sympathy was overwhelming. Diana loved Charles, Lady Spencer continued. Despite everything that happened between them, despite the pain and the disappointment, she loved him until the end. And she understood his nature better than anyone. She would have seen through this political maneuvering immediately, and she would have been disgusted by it. What do you mean? Camilla asked, though part of her dreaded the answer. Charles is being manipulated, just as he was manipulated during his marriage to Diana. There are people around him who understand his weaknesses, his need for approval, and guidance from figures he perceives as authoritative. They're using his genuine concerns about the monarchy to push him toward decisions that serve their own agenda. The idea that Charles might be as much a victim as she was hadn't occurred to Camilla. She had been so focused on his betrayal, his cold formality, and calculated cruelty, that she hadn't considered the possibility that he was being controlled by others. But, as she thought about it, the explanation made sense. Charles had always been susceptible to the influence of strong personalities, particularly those who claimed to have the monarchy's best interests at heart. Who's behind it? She asked, though she suspected she already knew part of the answer. Lord Pemberton has been positioning himself as a power broker for years, Lady Spencer said. He's built a network of allies in Parliament, the Church, and the media who share his vision of a reformed monarchy. Your marriage to Charles was always an obstacle to that vision, because it represented continuity with the old scandals rather than a clean break toward a new era. The pieces of the puzzle began falling into place in Camilla's mind. Lord Pemberton had always been polite to her face, but she had sensed an underlying coolness in his manner. She had attributed it to natural reserve, but now she wondered if it had been something more calculating. How long had he been working to undermine her position while pretending to serve the crown loyally? There's something else you should know, Lady Spencer continued, her voice dropping to nearly a whisper. They have a replacement in mind. Someone they believe will be more suitable for the role of queen consort. Someone who can help rehabilitate Charles's image and restore public confidence in the monarchy. Camilla felt as if the floor had dropped out from under her. Who? Lady Victoria Ashworth. She's young, beautiful, impeccably connected, and, most importantly, she has no controversial history. Her family has served the crown for generations, and she's been carefully groomed for royal life since childhood. More significantly, she's been seen in Charles's company at several private functions over the past few months. The name hit Camilla like a physical blow. Lady Victoria was indeed everything that Camilla was not. Young where she was aging, innocent where she was tainted by scandal, fresh where she was associated with old wounds. At 35, Victoria represented the future while Camilla embodied a problematic past that the monarchy apparently wanted to forget. How long has this been going on? Camilla asked, though she wasn't sure she could bear to hear the answer. I'm not certain of all the details, Lady Spencer said gently. But my sources suggest that Charles has been spending increasing amounts of time with Lady Victoria, ostensibly for charitable work and state functions. She's been presented as a suitable companion for official duties that require a younger, more dynamic royal presence. The euphemisms couldn't disguise the ugly reality. While Camilla had been faithfully performing her duties as queen consort, Charles had been evaluating her replacement. Every charitable gala, every state dinner, every public appearance she had made with pride and dedication had been occurring against the backdrop of her husband's secret courtship of another woman. I should have seen it coming, Camilla said bitterly. The signs were all there. His increasing absences, the way he looked through me rather than at me, the formal distance that crept into our relationship. I told myself it was the stress of the crown, the burden of kingship. I never imagined he was planning my destruction. Lady Spencer leaned forward in her chair, her expression earnest. Camilla, you still have options. This isn't over yet. There are people who support you, who believe that what's being done to you is wrong. But you'll need to act quickly if you want to fight back. The idea of fighting back seemed almost impossible to contemplate. How could she battle the combined forces of the government, the church, and the palace establishment? What weapons did she have against such overwhelming opposition? But, as she looked into Lady Spencer's determined eyes, she felt a small spark of hope kindle in her chest. What would you suggest? She asked. First, you need to understand exactly what you're facing. The annulment process isn't automatic, and there are legal and constitutional hurdles that must be overcome. You have rights, Camilla, and there are lawyers who specialize in exactly this kind of situation. You don't have to simply accept whatever Charles and his advisors decide is best. The thought of engaging in a legal battle against her own husband was heartbreaking, but Camilla realized that her marriage was already over in all but name. If Charles was determined to erase their union, she could at least ensure that she didn't make it easy for him. Second, you need allies within the establishment. Not everyone agrees with this course of action, and there are members of parliament, church officials, and even some royals who believe that what's being done to you sets a dangerous precedent. A queen should not be disposable simply because she becomes politically inconvenient. And third, Camilla asked, though part of her dreaded the answer, you need to consider going public with your side of the story. The narrative is being controlled by your opponents right now, but you have the power to change that. The British people may surprise you with their sense of fairness if they understand what's really happening. The idea of taking her private pain public was terrifying, but Camilla could see the logic in Lady Spencer's suggestion. For too long, she had allowed others to define her story, to cast her as the villain in other people's dramas. Perhaps it was time to tell her own truth, regardless of the consequences. Why are you helping me? Camilla asked again, still struggling to understand Lady Spencer's motivation. Because what's happening to you is wrong, came the simple reply. Because Diana would have wanted better for you, and for Charles. Because the monarchy should be about something more than political convenience and public relations calculations. And because someone needs to stand up to the people who think they can manipulate royal lives for their own purposes. As Lady Spencer prepared to leave, she pressed a small card into Camilla's hand. That's the contact information for Sir Richard Pembroke. He's one of the most respected constitutional lawyers in the country, and he's handled several high-profile cases involving the royal family. He's also someone who can't be bought or intimidated by the establishment. After Lady Spencer's departure, Camilla sat alone in her study as darkness fell across the palace grounds. The conversation had given her hope, but it had also crystallized the magnitude of what she was facing. She was essentially at war with her own husband and the institution she had served faithfully for years. The brandy glass in her hand reflected the firelight like liquid amber, and she found herself thinking about the young woman she had once been, full of dreams and determination, convinced that love could conquer any obstacle. That woman seemed like a stranger now, someone from a different lifetime who had believed in fairy tales and happy endings. But perhaps that young woman's fighting spirit still lived somewhere within her. Perhaps it was time to stop being the gracious victim and start being the formidable opponent that her enemies had underestimated. If Charles wanted to destroy their marriage, he would discover that she wouldn't go quietly into the darkness that others had chosen for her. The phone number on Sir Richard Pembroke's card seemed to glow in the firelight, representing a path forward that she had never imagined she would need to take. Tomorrow, she would make that call and begin the fight for her life, her crown, and her dignity. Tonight, she would mourn the death of her marriage and prepare for the battle that lay ahead. The gray London morning matched Camilla's mood as her car wound through the busy streets toward the discreet office building in Lincoln's Inn Fields where Sir Richard Pembroke practiced law. She had barely slept the night before, her mind racing through scenarios and possibilities, each one seeming more dire than the last. The weight of the previous day's revelations pressed down upon her shoulders like a physical burden, and she found herself questioning everything she thought she knew about her life and marriage. Sir Richard's chambers occupied the top floor of a Georgian building that had housed barristers for over 2 centuries. The walls were lined with leather-bound legal texts and portraits of distinguished judges, creating an atmosphere of gravitas and tradition that was both reassuring and intimidating. When Camilla was ushered into his private office, she was surprised to find a man in his early 50s with kind eyes and an unexpectedly warm smile. "Your Majesty," he said, rising from behind his massive oak desk. "Lady Spencer spoke very highly of you when she contacted me yesterday evening. Please, make yourself comfortable." The office was elegantly appointed but not ostentatious, with Persian rugs covering polished wooden floors and tall windows that looked out over the ancient courtyards below. Sir Richard gestured toward a sitting area with comfortable chairs arranged around a low table, creating an atmosphere more conducive to conversation than formal consultation. "I must confess," he began after they were both seated, "that in 30 years of practice, I've never had a case quite like this one. The constitutional implications alone are staggering, to say nothing of the personal and emotional dimensions involved." Camilla appreciated his directness. She had grown weary of diplomatic language and careful evasions. "Sir Richard, I need to understand my position legally. Can the king simply annul our marriage without my consent?" "That's a complex question with several layers," he replied, opening a thick file that she assumed contained research he had already begun on her case. Under canon law, which governs royal marriages, an annulment requires specific grounds: fraud, coercion, lack of capacity, or failure to consummate. The archbishop would need to be convinced that one or more of these conditions existed at the time of your marriage ceremony. "None of those conditions applied to our marriage," Camilla said firmly. "We were both free to marry, fully consenting adults who understood exactly what we were doing." "I agree, which makes their position legally questionable. However, they may attempt to argue that the circumstances of your relationship prior to the marriage, the fact that you were both involved with other people, the public controversy surrounding your union, somehow invalidated the sacrament. It's a stretch, but not impossible given the right ecclesiastical court." Camilla felt a flicker of hope. "So they can't simply wave a magic wand and make our marriage disappear?" "Absolutely not. You have legal rights that must be respected, regardless of political pressure or public opinion. The process would require formal proceedings, evidence, testimony, and a judgment by qualified church authorities. You would have every right to contest their claims and present your own evidence." Sir Richard leaned back in his chair, his expression growing more serious. "However, Your Majesty, I must warn you that fighting this battle will be extraordinarily difficult. The forces arrayed against you have significant resources and influence. They'll use every tool at their disposal to pressure you into compliance." "What kind of pressure?" Camilla asked, though she suspected she already knew part of the answer. "Financial, social, political. They'll isolate you from your support networks, question your mental stability, perhaps even threaten criminal prosecution on some trumped-up charge. The royal household has ways of making life very unpleasant for those who don't cooperate with their plans." The brutal honesty was both refreshing and terrifying. Camilla had lived within the royal system long enough to understand its capacity for destroying those who became inconvenient, but hearing it laid out so starkly by an expert made the danger feel immediate and personal. "There's something else you should know," Sir Richard continued. "Lady Spencer mentioned that His Majesty has been seen with Lady Victoria Ashworth. If there's already another relationship developing, they may attempt to use that as evidence of the invalidity of your marriage, suggesting that the king's affections were never truly committed to your union. The possibility that her own husband's infidelity could be used as evidence against her was breathtaking in its cruelty. Surely that's not legally sound reasoning? In a secular court, absolutely not. But ecclesiastical law operates under different principles, and there's significant discretion available to church authorities in interpreting the validity of marriages. If they want to find grounds for annulment, they'll find them." Camilla stared out the window at the bustling streets below, where ordinary people went about their daily lives without the weight of constitutional crises and royal intrigue pressing down upon them. She envied them their simple problems and straightforward solutions. "What would you advise me to do?" she asked finally. "First, we need to document everything: your marriage ceremony, the circumstances leading up to it, any evidence that demonstrates the validity and sincerity of your union. We'll need witnesses who can testify to the genuine nature of your relationship and your commitment to your royal duties." Sir Richard pulled out a yellow legal pad and began making notes as he spoke. "Second, we need to identify potential allies within the establishment: church officials, members of parliament, other royals who might be sympathetic to your position. This can't be fought in isolation. And third, we need to be prepared for a very public battle. The other side will certainly try to conduct this process in secret, controlling the narrative and minimizing public scrutiny. Our best defense may be transparency, forcing them to justify their actions in the full light of public attention. The thought of her private pain being dissected in the media was horrifying, but Camilla could see the strategic logic. How do we do that? Carefully and strategically. We'll need to work with sympathetic journalists, provide them with accurate information about what's really happening, and ensure that your voice is heard alongside whatever propaganda the palace chooses to release. As if summoned by their conversation, Sir Richard's secretary knocked and entered with a concerned expression. I'm sorry to interrupt, sir, but there's been a development. The Times is preparing to run a story tomorrow morning about Her Majesty's marriage. They've requested a comment. Camilla's heart sank. What kind of story? According to our contact there, it's being presented as an exclusive investigation into the constitutional crisis surrounding the monarchy. The headline apparently refers to serious questions about the validity of the royal marriage and suggests that senior government officials are deeply concerned about the implications for constitutional stability. Sir Richard's expression darkened. They're moving faster than I expected. This is clearly a coordinated effort to establish the narrative before you have a chance to respond. Who's the byline? Jonathan Hartwell and Rebecca Morrison. They usually cover Westminster politics, not royal affairs. That's significant, Sir Richard said to Camilla. They're treating this as a political story rather than a royal one, which suggests they're getting their information from government sources rather than palace sources. That tells us something about where the real pressure is coming from. Camilla felt the walls closing in around her. Can we stop the story from running? Not likely, and attempting to do so would only confirm its importance. But we can make sure your side of the story is available to other outlets immediately. The key is to get ahead of their narrative rather than simply responding to it. The next few hours passed in a blur of strategic planning and urgent phone calls. Sir Richard's office became a war room, with maps of political alliances spread across his desk and lists of potential media contacts being compiled by his staff. Camilla found herself thrust into a role she had never imagined, not just defending her marriage, but fighting for her very survival in a system that seemed determined to erase her. As the afternoon wore on, more disturbing news arrived. The Archbishop of Canterbury had issued a statement saying that the church was reviewing certain matters relating to royal marriages and would be making announcements in due course. The Prime Minister had declined to comment on ongoing constitutional discussions, but emphasized his government's commitment to supporting the monarchy through challenging transitions. They're preparing the ground, Sir Richard observed grimly, creating the impression of inevitability, making it seem as though this process is already underway and your consent is merely a formality. By evening, Camilla felt emotionally and physically exhausted. The day had been a crash course in political warfare, and she was beginning to understand the magnitude of the forces arrayed against her. But something had also crystallized within her, a determination to fight back that surprised her with its intensity. Sir Richard, she said as they prepared to conclude their meeting, I need to ask you something directly. Do you think I can win this battle? He was quiet for a long moment, considering his response carefully. Your Majesty, this isn't just about winning or losing. This is about standing up for principles that matter, the sanctity of marriage, the rights of individuals within the monarchy, and the idea that people shouldn't be discarded simply because they become politically inconvenient. That's not really an answer. You're right, it's not. He met her gaze directly. Can you win? Yes, I believe you can. But it will cost you everything you have, and even if you succeed, your marriage to Charles may not survive the process. Are you prepared for that possibility? The question hung in the air between them like a challenge. Camilla thought about the man she had fallen in love with all those years ago, the prince who had seemed so different from the cold stranger who had sat across from her in the blue drawing room. Was there anything left of that relationship worth saving? Or had it already been destroyed by the forces that now sought to erase it entirely? My marriage may already be over, she said finally. But my dignity and my rights are not negotiable. If Charles wants to dispose of me, he'll have to do it properly, through legal processes that I can challenge. I won't simply disappear because it's convenient for everyone else. Sir Richard smiled for the first time that day. Then, we have our answer. Tomorrow morning, when that story runs, we'll be ready with our own response. The battle begins now. As Camilla's car carried her through the darkening streets back toward the palace, she felt a strange mixture of terror and exhilaration. The comfortable certainties of her royal life had been shattered, but in their place was something she hadn't felt in years, a sense of agency, of being an active participant in her own fate rather than simply a decorative figure moved around at others' convenience. The palace loomed ahead of her in the gathering dusk, its windows glowing with warm light that had once seemed welcoming but now felt ominous. Somewhere within those walls, Charles was probably meeting with his advisors, planning the next phase of their campaign against her. But now she had advisors of her own, allies who understood that the battle for her marriage was really a battle for something much larger. Tomorrow, the war would begin in earnest. Tonight, she would prepare herself for the fight of her life, drawing on reserves of strength she hadn't known she possessed. The queen they thought they could quietly dispose of was about to show them exactly how formidable an opponent they had underestimated. The morning headlines were everything Sir Richard had predicted they would be, and worse. The Times led with constitutional crisis, questions mount over royal marriage validity, in bold typeface that dominated the front page. The Guardian followed with palace sources. King seeks church guidance on marriage issues, while the tabloids were characteristically more direct. The Sun's Camilla's crown in crisis was accompanied by an unflattering photograph that seemed deliberately chosen to make her appear older and more haggard than her 65 years. Camilla sat in her private breakfast room, the newspapers spread before her like evidence in a trial she hadn't realized was underway. Her hands trembled slightly as she read the carefully worded articles that managed to suggest everything while stating nothing directly. Anonymous palace sources spoke of growing concerns about constitutional propriety and the need for careful consideration of all options. Church officials expressed their commitment to upholding the highest standards of matrimonial validity, while government ministers emphasized their support for appropriate constitutional processes. The message was clear even through the diplomatic language. Her marriage was under review, her position was precarious, and powerful forces were aligned against her. But what struck her most forcefully was how completely she had been written out of the narrative. In every article, she appeared as a passive figure, someone whose fate was being decided by others rather than an active participant with rights and opinions of her own. Mrs. Hartwell entered with the morning's correspondence, her usually composed expression showing signs of strain. "Your Majesty, there have been over 200 media requests since yesterday evening. Sir Richard Pembroke's office has been coordinating responses, and they've scheduled a press conference for this afternoon." "A press conference?" Camilla asked, surprised. She hadn't authorized any such thing. Sir Richard felt it was essential to respond quickly to the morning's coverage, Mrs. Hartwell explained. "He says that allowing the other side's narrative to dominate for even one news cycle could be catastrophic for your position." The speed at which events were unfolding was breathtaking and terrifying. Camilla had always moved in the careful, measured rhythms of royal life, where every decision was deliberated extensively and public statements were crafted with painstaking precision. This new world of rapid-fire media responses and strategic counterattacks felt alien and overwhelming. Her private telephone rang, and Mrs. Hartwell answered with practiced efficiency. After a brief conversation, she turned back to Camilla with a grave expression. "That was Sir Richard's office. His Majesty has requested an immediate audience with you in the blue drawing room." Camilla's stomach clenched. She had hoped to avoid another confrontation with Charles until she was better prepared, until Sir Richard's strategy had time to develop and take effect. But apparently, her husband, or the people controlling him, had decided to accelerate their timeline in response to the morning's media coverage. "Tell Sir Richard's office where I'm going," she instructed Mrs. Hartwell. "I want them to know exactly when this meeting begins and when it ends." The corridors of the palace felt different now that she knew she was viewed as an enemy rather than a partner. Staff members who had served her faithfully for years now seemed to avoid her gaze, and she wondered how many of them had already been told that her time as queen consort was coming to an end. The royal household was a complex ecosystem of loyalties and dependencies, and she understood that most of its inhabitants would quickly align themselves with whoever appeared to be winning the power struggle. The blue drawing room was occupied by the same three men as before: Charles, Lord Pemberton, and Sir James Morrison, but their demeanor had shifted noticeably. Where there had previously been at least a pretense of courtesy and regret, now there was only cold determination. They were no longer asking for her cooperation, they were demanding her surrender. "Camilla," Charles began without preamble, This morning's media coverage has made it clear that discretion is no longer possible. The situation has moved beyond private family discussions. She took her seat with careful composure, drawing on decades of experience in maintaining royal dignity under pressure. I wasn't aware that our private family discussions had been shared with the media, Charles. Perhaps you could explain how that happened. Lord Pemberton cleared his throat diplomatically. Your Majesty, it was felt that some guidance of the public narrative was necessary to prevent wild speculation and conspiracy theories. The coverage has been carefully calibrated to emphasize the constitutional issues rather than personal matters. How thoughtful of you to protect my privacy in such a public manner, Camilla replied dryly. I'm curious about this sudden urgency. Yesterday you said I could have time to consider your proposal. Today you seem to be demanding an immediate decision. Sir James Morrison leaned forward in his chair. The situation has evolved rapidly, ma'am. The Prime Minister has been in communication with His Majesty throughout the night. There are concerns in government about market stability, international relations, and the constitutional implications of prolonged uncertainty. The mention of market stability and international relations suggested that the pressure to resolve this situation quickly was coming from sources far beyond the palace walls. Camilla realized that she had underestimated the scope of the forces arrayed against her. This wasn't just a palace coup, but a coordinated effort involving the highest levels of government and possibly international allies. What exactly are you proposing? She asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. Charles looked uncomfortable for the first time in their recent interactions, and she wondered if some remnant of his genuine feelings for her still existed beneath the political calculations. The Archbishop has agreed to expedite the annulment process if both parties consent. The proceedings could be completed within a matter of weeks rather than months. And if I don't consent? Then, we proceed anyway, Lord Pemberton said bluntly. The Church has sufficient grounds to act unilaterally, based on questions that have been raised about the circumstances of your marriage. Your cooperation would make the process less contentious, but it's not legally required. The naked threat was almost refreshing after all the diplomatic doublespeak. At least now she knew exactly where she stood. They were prepared to destroy her with or without her consent, though they would prefer her complicity to make the process appear more legitimate. I see, Camilla said calmly. And what becomes of me after this expedited annulment? You would retain your personal honors and titles, Sir James Morrison explained. There would be a generous financial settlement, appropriate housing arrangements, and continued security protection. You would be expected to maintain discretion about royal family matters, but otherwise you would be free to live as you choose. A golden cage with a lifetime gag order, Camilla translated. How generous. Charles's expression hardened. Camilla, you're not making this any easier for yourself or anyone else. The decision has been made at the highest levels of government and the Church. Fighting it will only prolong your suffering and damage the monarchy further. For the first time in the conversation, Camilla allowed her composure to slip slightly, letting some of her anger and pain show through the royal mask. My suffering, Charles? You're destroying our marriage, erasing our life together, and plotting to replace me with a younger woman. And you're concerned about my suffering? Where was that concern when you were meeting secretly with church officials and government ministers to plan my downfall? The room fell silent, and she could see that her direct challenge had unsettled them. They had expected her to maintain the polite fiction that this was all being done for noble constitutional reasons rather than personal and political convenience. Your Majesty, Lord Pemberton said carefully. Emotions are understandably running high, but we must focus on what's best for the institution of the monarchy. Personal feelings, however valid, cannot override constitutional necessity. Constitutional necessity? Camilla stood abruptly, her voice rising despite her efforts to maintain control. Is that what we're calling it when a queen becomes inconvenient? When the polling numbers suggest that a younger, prettier replacement might be more popular with the public? Charles stood as well, his face flushed with anger or embarrassment. That's quite enough, Camilla. You're becoming hysterical, and this conversation is clearly pointless if you're going to indulge in conspiracy theories and personal attacks. The accusation of hysteria, that ancient weapon used against women who dared to express anger or fight back, hit her like a physical slap. She had been called many things over the years, but never hysterical. The fact that it came from Charles, who had once claimed to love her above all others, made it particularly devastating. Hysterical, she repeated quietly, her voice now deadly calm. Charles, I've just discovered that my husband has been plotting to annul our marriage while courting my replacement. I think a little emotion is perfectly reasonable under the circumstances. Sir James Morrison shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Perhaps we should adjourn this discussion and reconvene when everyone has had time to consider their positions more carefully. No, Camilla said firmly. I want an answer to a direct question. Charles, do you love Lady Victoria Ashworth? The question hung in the air like a sword, and she could see the three men exchanging glances as they tried to formulate a response that wouldn't be legally damaging or politically explosive. Charles's silence stretched for what felt like an eternity before he finally spoke. My personal feelings are irrelevant to the constitutional issues we're discussing. The monarchy requires decisions based on duty and necessity, not emotional attachments. It wasn't a denial, and they both knew it. The careful non-answer told her everything she needed to know about the true nature of his relationship with Lady Victoria and the real reasons behind this sudden constitutional crisis. I understand, she said quietly, sitting back down and smoothing her skirt with steady hands. Then, let me be equally clear about my position. I will not consent to this annulment. If you wish to proceed, you'll have to do it over my objections and face whatever consequences that might entail. Lord Pemberton's expression darkened. Your Majesty, I would strongly advise you to reconsider that position. Fighting this process will be expensive, emotionally devastating, and ultimately futile. The resources available to challenge your decision are virtually unlimited. Then, I suppose we'll discover just how unlimited they are, Camilla replied. Gentlemen, unless there's something else you need to discuss, I believe this conversation is over. As she walked toward the door, Charles called out to her one last time. Camilla, please don't make this harder than it has to be. For your own sake, and for the sake of everything we once meant to each other. She paused with her hand on the door handle, looking back at the man she had loved for so many years. For just a moment, she thought she saw a flicker of genuine regret in his eyes. A shadow of the person he had been before the crown had transformed him into someone she barely recognized. Charles, she said softly, if you proceed with this annulment, there will be no going back. You'll have to live with the consequences of destroying our marriage for the rest of your life. Are you prepared for that? He didn't answer, and she didn't expect him to. The time for meaningful communication between them had passed, replaced by the cold calculations of political necessity and constitutional convenience. As she left the blue drawing room for what she suspected would be the last time, Camilla felt a strange sense of liberation. The worst had happened. Her marriage was effectively over, her position was under attack, and she was about to become the center of a very public and very ugly battle. But she was no longer waiting for other people to decide her fate. The fight had begun, and she intended to give her opponents a battle they would never forget. The afternoon press conference Sir Richard had arranged was scheduled to begin in 2 hours. It was time to tell her side of the story and let the British people decide for themselves whether a queen should be discarded simply because she had become inconvenient to the men who claimed to serve the crown. The press conference was held in the Grand Ballroom of the Savoy Hotel, a venue chosen specifically for its historical significance and elegant neutrality. Sir Richard had insisted on a formal setting that would lend gravity to Camilla's statements while avoiding any appearance of seeking sanctuary in royal property. The assembled journalists represented every major British newspaper and television network, along with international correspondents who had flown in overnight as the story gained global attention. Camilla stood at the podium, her navy blue suit chosen to project authority and dignity, her hair perfectly styled despite the emotional turmoil of the previous days. She had spent hours with Sir Richard rehearsing her statement, crafting each word to maximize impact while minimizing legal vulnerability. But now, facing the sea of cameras and recording devices, she felt the weight of history settling on her shoulders. Ladies and gentlemen, she began, her voice clear and steady despite the magnitude of what she was about to reveal. I have called this press conference to address the serious allegations that have been made about my marriage to His Majesty King Charles III, and to correct the record about the circumstances surrounding the current constitutional discussions. The room was absolutely silent except for the soft whir of camera motors and the scratch of pens on paper. Every reporter present understood that they were witnessing a historic moment, the first time in modern history that a queen consort had publicly challenged the official royal narrative about her own position. For the past several days, you have read stories suggesting that serious questions exist about the validity of my marriage to the king. These stories have been carefully orchestrated by individuals within the government and the church who seek to remove me from my position for reasons that have nothing to do with constitutional propriety or legal validity. A murmur ran through the assembled press corps. Camilla was not merely defending herself. She was directly accusing senior officials of conspiracy. The implications were staggering, and she could see journalists frantically scribbling notes as they realized the explosive nature of her allegations. My marriage to Charles took place in 2005 after years of careful consideration and proper consultation with all relevant authorities. It was conducted according to both civil and religious law, with the full knowledge and consent of the Church of England and the British government. No serious legal scholar has ever questioned its validity until now, when certain individuals have decided that I have become a political inconvenience. Sir Richard stood at the back of the room, monitoring the reactions of the journalists and palace representatives who were undoubtedly present. His strategy was risky. By going on the offensive rather than simply defending against the attacks, they were escalating the conflict to a level where compromise would be almost impossible. But he had convinced Camilla that half measures would only prolong her agony, without changing the ultimate outcome. The real reason for this sudden constitutional crisis has nothing to do with the validity of my marriage, Camilla continued, her voice growing stronger as she spoke. It has to do with polling data that suggests the monarchy might be more popular with a younger queen consort, and with political calculations about how to modernize the royal image for a new generation. She paused for a moment, allowing the weight of her words to settle over the room. When she spoke again, her voice carried a note of personal pain that no amount of royal training could entirely disguise. I have served as queen consort for nearly 2 years, dedicating myself completely to the duties and responsibilities of the position. I have supported His Majesty through the challenges of his accession, represented the crown at hundreds of official functions, and worked tirelessly to serve the British people with honor and dignity. The suggestion that this service has somehow been inadequate or inappropriate is both hurtful and false. In the audience, she could see several journalists who had covered her royal work over the years nodding slightly in recognition of her dedication. Whatever personal opinions they might hold about her controversial path to the throne, most had witnessed firsthand her commitment to her royal duties. What I find most troubling about this situation is not the personal attack on my position, but what it represents for the future of the monarchy. If a queen consort can be discarded simply because focus groups suggest that someone else might be more popular, then the institution of royal marriage becomes nothing more than a public relations exercise subject to the changing whims of political consultants. The constitutional implications of her argument were profound, and she could see the political correspondents in the audience beginning to understand the broader significance of what was happening. This wasn't just about Camilla's personal fate. It was about the fundamental nature of royal marriage and the stability of the crown itself. I have been informed that His Majesty has been conducting what can only be described as a courtship of Lady Victoria Ashworth, a woman 30 years my junior, who is being positioned as my replacement. This relationship has been developing for months while I continued to perform my duties as his wife and queen consort, unaware that my position was being systematically undermined. The revelation about Lady Victoria sent a visible shock through the press corps. Several reporters immediately began texting their editors, recognizing that this single statement had transformed the story from a constitutional crisis into a royal romance scandal of unprecedented proportions. I want to be absolutely clear about my position going forward, Camilla said, her voice now ringing with determination. I will not consent to the annulment of my marriage. I will challenge any attempt to invalidate our union through legal and ecclesiastical proceedings. And I will continue to serve as queen consort until such time as a properly constituted court of law determines otherwise. The defiance was unmistakable, and the assembled journalists understood that they were witnessing the beginning of what could be the most dramatic royal battle since the abdication crisis of 1936. But, unlike that earlier constitutional crisis, this one would play out in the full glare of modern media attention, with every detail scrutinized and every development analyzed by experts around the world. I ask only for what every British citizen is entitled to: due process, the right to defend myself against false accusations, and the opportunity to have my case heard by impartial authorities rather than by individuals who have already decided the outcome they desire. As she prepared to conclude her statement, Camilla allowed herself a moment of personal reflection on the journey that had brought her to this unprecedented moment. She thought of the young woman who had first fallen in love with Prince Charles decades ago, of the years of secrecy and scandal that had preceded their marriage, of the hopes and dreams she had invested in their life together. To the British people, I say this. I have always strived to serve you with integrity and dedication. I have made mistakes in my life, as we all have, but I have never wavered in my commitment to the duties and responsibilities that came with my position as your queen consort. I ask only for your patience as this matter proceeds through proper legal channels, and for your understanding that sometimes standing up for what is right requires difficult choices. The final paragraph of her statement was the most personal and perhaps the most powerful. Speaking directly to the camera, her voice carried the weight of genuine emotion that no amount of royal protocol could contain. To Charles, my husband of 18 years, I say this. I loved you when you were a prince struggling to find his purpose, and I love you now as a king burdened by the weight of the crown. But love cannot survive betrayal, and trust cannot be rebuilt from the ashes of calculated destruction. If you proceed with this annulment, you will have chosen political expediency over personal loyalty, and that choice will define the rest of your reign. The silence that followed her conclusion was absolute. For several seconds, no one in the room seemed to breathe, let alone speak. Then, the questions began, a barrage of inquiries about legal strategy, royal protocol, and personal feelings that Sir Richard had prepared her to deflect with dignity. But the real impact of her statement would not be measured in the immediate aftermath of the press conference. It would be found in the headlines that appeared within hours, in the editorial responses that followed over the coming days, and in the public opinion polls that would gauge how the British people responded to her unprecedented challenge to the royal establishment. By evening, the palace had issued its own statement, carefully worded to avoid direct confrontation while maintaining the official position. His Majesty respects the Queen Consort's right to express her views and looks forward to resolving these matters through appropriate channels. The King remains committed to serving the British people and upholding the constitutional principles that guide the monarchy. But, privately, the response was far more dramatic. Emergency meetings were convened throughout Whitehall as government officials struggled to assess the damage to royal prestige and constitutional stability. The Archbishop of Canterbury issued a statement emphasizing the Church's commitment to careful deliberation and prayer in addressing complex matrimonial questions. International allies began expressing concern about British political stability at a time when global leadership was desperately needed. In her private chambers that night, Camilla sat alone with a single glass of champagne, not in celebration, but in recognition of the fact that she had crossed a line from which there could be no return. She had challenged the monarchy publicly, something that no royal consort had ever done in the modern era. The consequences of her actions would unfold over the coming weeks and months, but she had finally taken control of her own narrative. The morning newspapers would be brutal, she knew. The palace would deploy every resource at its disposal to discredit her claims and minimize the damage to royal prestige. Charles would be under enormous pressure to respond decisively, to demonstrate that the crown could not be challenged by a disgruntled spouse. But she had accomplished something important that day. She had spoken her truth publicly, refused to be quietly discarded, and forced the British people to confront uncomfortable questions about the nature of royal marriage and the treatment of women within the monarchy. Whatever the ultimate outcome of her battle, she had ensured that it would be fought in the open rather than in the shadows of palace intrigue. The phone beside her bed rang softly, and she recognized Sir Richard's voice immediately. Your Majesty, I wanted you to know that the initial response has been extraordinary. We're receiving calls from supporters around the world, from legal experts offering assistance, from members of Parliament expressing concern about the constitutional implications. You've changed the entire dynamic of this situation. As Camilla prepared for bed, she felt a sense of peace that had eluded her for weeks. The battle was far from over. In many ways, it was just beginning. But she had proven to herself and to the world that she was more than just a decorative figure to be moved around at the convenience of others. She was a woman with agency, dignity, and the courage to fight for what she believed was right. The crown that had once seemed like the culmination of her dreams now felt like a burden she might be better off without. But whether she kept it or lost it, she would do so on her own terms, with her head held high and her dignity intact. Charles had shattered their bonds forever, but in doing so, he had freed her to become someone stronger than she had ever imagined possible.